Okay, hello, hello, hello. Let me just check that everyone can hear me before I start this live stream. Happy Sunday, everyone. God bless you all. Happy Lord's Day. I went to church this morning, had a great time, and realized that I need to get deep in prayer in my spiritual life. And I hope that everyone is also reflecting on these spiritual things as well. Just let me know in the comments section if you can hear me. Let me just type in to make sure that everyone can hear. Make sure that everyone can hear me. You might hear me better now, actually. I can hear you. Okay, good, perfect. If at any point you guys stop hearing me, just let me know. Hey, what's up? Five fruits. God bless. Okay, so in today's video, or well, live stream really, I don't normally do live streams because I don't have very much equipment. Uh, and this will link into the channel update. So for this channel, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to upload as much as I would like to, or as much as maybe I used to, which was maybe twice a week or once a week. And that's because, unfortunately, in my personal life, I'm graduating from becoming a boy to really my own man is what I'm attempting to do in my personal life. And it takes time, resources, money, etc. So I'm transgressing to some of the next steps in my life, but that does not mean that this YouTube channel is stopping. Now, what I do want to do is post any research, any arguments that I make, any interesting points that I want to make, and put it onto this channel. Because I do think that sometimes on this channel we can give creative insights and help to break down some pretty complicated topics down to layman levels. Okay? And that's the goal of the Thomas Apologia YouTube channel is to hopefully give new creative arguments, give my insights and thoughts on some of these topics, such as divine simplicity, such as the Trinity, etc., etc. And also what I want to do is to be able to help people grow in their knowledge of that, even people as laymen. I want to be able to break down information which is maybe at a higher level than some people think it is and help to bring it towards laymen. And I'm not saying that I'm someone who is particularly intellectual myself. I'm not trying to make claims like that. However, that is one of the goals of this channel. Okay, can everyone still hear me? Is that okay? And okay, it looks like everyone can still hear me. Okay, good. Now, with that being said, I do have a big update on some of my personal beliefs and attitudes, guys. So, if you saw my video a few videos back titled The Indeterministic Collapse, you would have realized that now I am leaning towards being slightly more agnostic on divine simplicity. And you may be wondering, Thomas Apologia, you are the main catalyst guy who always pushes divine simplicity. Oh, you're the guy that went to Speaker's Corner and said it all. I know, but now I have come across, well, not come across, I created the argument myself, but I think I have some sufficient reasons as to why to at least be doubtful of the mainstream conceptions, at least, of divine simplicity, to put it lightly. And that's why in this video I wanted to break down my argument from the indeterministic collapse to a more layman level. Because I noticed when reading the comment section on my video on the indeterministic collapse, a lot of people didn't really understand the language that was being used there. Perhaps that's my fault in communicating it. And a lot of people sort of brushed it over because they didn't understand what the video was even about. So I want to, in this video or this live stream, help some people who may be less learned on this topic to be able to catch up to speed on this argument. And hopefully some people can even challenge this argument itself. I would honestly love it if somebody managed to refute it. then I could be like, hey, I'm all in again on divine simplicity. But until then, I'm going to remain just agnostic on divine simplicity itself. So, with that being said, why don't we go back to that video and read the actual syllogism for the argument? Because some of you haven't watched it and some of you may be questioning, what is it? So, if I put my display capture on here, hopefully, do I mean ADS or DS in general? Well, I don't really see too much of a distinction between it. What I'm particularly pointing towards is particularly the doctrine of immutability for God when pushed to like its highest form. That basically none of God's predicates could change, nothing about God or that's assigned to him could change. I think with when you are trying to pair that with also God knows contingent things and avoiding the modal collapse, that's the primary concern. And I think even in this video, you could make some really weird models of theism where you could still maintain like the mereology of some divine simplicity and also get around this argument. But it would be weird. You'd have to imply some mutability in God, which generally people that believe in divine simplicity don't want to do. Hi, are you Roman Catholic? I'm not Roman Catholic. I am inquiring into Roman Catholicism, and I would say this is a hurdle for me when inquiring into it. I guess only difference is that you could push ADS into being some absolute monism denying even the Trinity, but that's just a naming distinction. I still don't think that ADS contradicts the Trinity because I think the mereology of ADS, absolute divine simplicity, all you really need to adhere to is that like all these predicates or these persons in God, etc., are just identical to the same divine essence. Because if you look at the mereology in divine simplicity, typically we want to define a part as that which is less than the entirety of its subject, right? So um, let's say you have a predicate about God, omnipotence, right? If that predicate is less than the entirety of God, then, well, according to that definition, it's going to be a part. So in divine simplicity, what's being attempted to do here is to work with what I typically see to be this definition of parts and wholes, and then show that God isn't composed of these things. Now, you might see in someone like Scotus, it might be a bit different, where Scotus might say, well, there can still be a formal distinction between some of God's attributes. However, that formal distinction is prior to the intellect. So, therefore, you know, there is maybe some real lack of identity and extramental reality between these formalities, right? However, they're all still identical to the same res, which is looking swell, brother. Have you confronted Desmond? He's talking about anabolic steroids. I do not promote any anabolic steroids, guys. I'm completely natural, but thank you for the compliment. But anyways, so that would be maybe a way that a Scotus might articulate it. A Thomist would probably not hold that the distinction between the formalities is prior to the intellect. However, to get into this argument, let's actually jump into this. So I'm glad that everyone can hear me. I only made that comment just to try to create a distinction between ADS and DS because otherwise they are the same. I would have to see what people are meaning by DS itself, divine simplicity itself, and its distinction from absolute divine simplicity. Okay, but um, what I did here is I actually made a Word document. Hopefully everyone can see this. Um, so here is a rough syllogism of the indeterministic collapse. Let me just make sure that everyone can see that. Sure myself, I'm not sure. Okay, just put like a 1 in the chat if you saw that or not. I'm pretty, I'm really bad with technology, guys. And there are some videos here we're going to be reacting to that I just barely planned before this. Okay, I'm going to assume that everyone saw that. thoughts on Bob of Speaker's Corner? I think Bob is a fine guy. Yeah, I've met Bob a few times. He's an awesome guy. Okay, one. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's get into the actual argument here. So, firstly, let's articulate some of the views that are going to be in contention with this argument, right? So we know, because what we're attempting to do with some of these reductio arguments is we're attempting to list a set of beliefs that someone might believe in, and then what we're attempting to do is show, hey, these are inconsistent with one another. Something's got to go here, right? So one belief might be God is immutable. Now, I don't just mean here immutable in the sense that, oh, well, God's essential properties might be immutable, but there might be some other properties about God which are mutable. And some neoclassical theists will say that. I mean, God is immutable in the absolute sense that anything predicated of him, it cannot change. God is not cross-world variant in any sense, okay? So that's what we mean when we say God is immutable. And then the second belief is just God knows contingent facts. So God knows contingent facts. What do we mean by contingent facts? All we mean is just that there are things about the world that could have been elsewise, right? Like these keys right here. Maybe Thomas Apologia didn't have to pick up these keys. Maybe in another way the world could have been, he didn't pick up those keys, right? So that might be a contingent fact that, well, maybe God knows. Maybe God knows that I just picked up those keys, right? If he has knowledge of contingent facts. Or maybe, well, maybe everything about the universe is necessary. Each syllable of each sentence that I'm saying to this camera right now, perhaps it is all necessary and causally determined by some prior cause in some really long causal chain. That's also perhaps an option, right? But in this argument, we want to say that these two beliefs result in some sort of a contradiction, right? Because, guys, the modal collapse argument, right, isn't just an argument against divine simplicity itself, right? Because you might not believe in divine simplicity, and you might say, well, maybe God's properties, they might all be distinct from each other, they might be really distinct from God's essence. You might even say they might be parts or something like that, or you might want to avoid part whole language there. But if you say that God is absolutely immutable in this sense, then the modal collapse still kind of applies to you, right? Because all the modal collapse is saying is that, well, if God's will is necessary, okay, God is immutable, check, God is necessary, all his predicates are necessary about him, that comes with God being immutable. So we got the first part of the modal collapse there, just from God being immutable, right? So it's not something that only applies to divine simplicity. It generally can apply to immutability, right? So if a simple version of the modal collapse just says that, well, if God's will is necessary, then what God wills is going to therefore be necessary, and thus creation is necessary. Now, that's not a very good version of the modal collapse, but that is just one small little one to get your brain working with some of these arguments, right? So essentially, the modal collapse is trying to, well, it can show that God is immutable, is inconsistent with um, that creation is contingent or contingent, right? Because, well, if God, his will designates his effect and his will is necessary, it's immutable, it doesn't change. Well, if anything necessarily designates another thing, then that other thing is necessarily going to come about, it seems to be the case. So, how do divine simplists get around this initial problem? Well, I think that the only plausible way to get around it, and people like Joe Schmidt in his paper on the providential collapse think it's the only plausible way to get around it, and even Christopher Tomaszewski in his paper on, I think it's titled Collapsing the Modal Collapse, he thinks that this is the best way to get around it, right? And that is to say that God's will is causally indeterminate, right? Let me just make sure that everyone is still with me. We can't see your screen. With respect to immutability. Okay, can you guys see my screen or not? Hold up. Oh, I think I know why you can't see my screen. Okay, that is why you can't see my screen. That's quite silly of me. Hang on. Uh, All right, there we go, guys. That's my mistake. I told you I'm really bad with technology. All right, hopefully everyone can see properly. I might minimize myself a bit more here as well. All right, we can see you, but not your screen. Okay, I don't know if Christian values revival is just trying to troll. I assumed you were taking notes for your own sake. No, I was typing down some notes for people to follow along with. So just to catch everyone up to speed, these are the two things that this argument down here, the indeterministic collapse, is trying to show is inconsistent beliefs with one another. And this belief right here, that God is immutable, is a belief that the modal collapse can show isn't consistent with God having contingent effects. Now, to recap, the way that I think is best, and I don't think there is really any other way to solve the modal collapse, is to say that God's will is causally indeterminate. Okay? Now, when a lot of people hear that, they think, whoa, God's will is causally indeterminate. So are you saying that God's will isn't a sufficient explanation for its effect? God's will is somehow inadequate to cause its effect? That's not what causal indeterminacy means. So, causal indeterminacy. Now, I'm just going to give an off the cuff, off my brain definition of this, but if you read some of the literature on it, I'm sure you'll be able to come to a more thorough understanding of it. So I'm just going to define it as prior to the effect, the cause can be indifferent in its state and possibly produce different possible effects. So, what's like an example of this? Let's say Thomas Apologia picks up his house keys, right? Let's say I do that. Now, there's a causal chain of explanations that leads towards me picking them up. Now, what we have to ask ourselves is the question is each cause in that chain a determinate cause? Does it guarantee that one effect will happen rather than another, right? Because things that are causally determinate have something called a contrastive explanation, which explains why one thing comes about rather than another, right? So let's say perhaps I had the ability to not pick up my keys just here, right? Let's say maybe I didn't even have to do that, right? Well, then there would have to be some causal indeterminacy in that chain. Perhaps it's at the final part where my will is, right? Maybe I could have willed not to. Well, that means that in my will, the descriptive content, I will pick up these keys or I will not pick up these keys, isn't going to be there. And there's not going to be an explanation that's non-probabilistic as to why I would or I would not pick up those keys, right? Because if there was a non-probabilistic explanation as to why I will pick up those keys rather than not, then essentially that cause in that chain is determining me to pick up those keys, right? So causal indeterminacy just says, hey, look, well, maybe Thomas Apology's will, prior to picking up those keys, it can be indifferent in the way it is, and multiple possible things could come about from it. And it seems definitionally, this is what you're going to have to accept if you want to say that there is no modal collapse, that you want to maintain God's immutability and you want to maintain God's ability to freely cause. Now, the problem with this then means that God's will doesn't really contain any descriptive or representational, or it doesn't designate its effect. Because otherwise it would have some sort of a contrastive explanation for its effect, why one effect comes about rather than another. And obviously, if that explanation, that description, representation, designation, however you want to word it, if that is internal to God, then it's going to be immutable. It's going to be necessary, right? And of course, if there's a contrastive explanation as to why God creates world one over world two, necessarily and unchangeably in God's will, then in every possible world, God is always going to create that world rather than another, unless you have some variability in God's will, right? Which would imply some change in God. So that's part of the problem that we're looking at here. And that is premise one of this argument down here, right? That if God's will is indeterminate, then his will doesn't describe, represent, or designate his contingent effects. And the reason why I've put describe slash represent slash designate is because normally when people come to this part of the argument, they want to be difficult about language and say, well, we don't think that God's will describes his effect. But in some sense, you are eventually going to have to say that something about God's will um, does not or does describe or depict or designate in some manner of language his effects, right? And the issue here is that if it does describe his effects and it is something internal to him, then it's going to be necessary and unchangeable. And then you get the modal collapse. And this is what, in Tomaszewski's paper about it, this is where he talks about his rigid designation and flaccid designation. If you read Tomaszewski's paper, you'll understand what I mean by that, okay? So then, in order to avoid this being necessary, you would have to say that there is no contrastive explanation, aka that his will does not describe or represent or designate what his contingent effects will be. Okay? Now, then we'll get on to why this is problematic in a moment. So then we get to premise two here, which is that God's will is indeterminate, which is definitional from just the definition here. Now, if you want to deny that, then you need to find a way of avoiding modal collapse or anything without appealing to causal indeterminacy. But the fact of the matter is that if you have a causal chain and its history is entirely causally determinate, then it's going to be determinate. It's going to be necessary. If you're starting with God as the necessary being, you're not going to be able to escape necessitarianism, right? So now that we've just briefly covered those first two premises, let me just see if everyone is following along. Clickbait title. It's not real. To be fair, it's not really a clickbait title because I guess in some sense we are attempting to um, refute divine simplicity in some way. Heard Thomas is converting to Orthodox Mormonism. Can you zoom it in more, please? Someone tell him to zoom the screen in more. Let me see what I can do here. Maybe that will zoom it in a bit more. Just enough. Okay. Would you uphold to Aristotelian causes? My personal belief right now, I don't have a problem with like Aristotle's four causes. You could maybe like expand upon that. Um, I think that is the act potency distinction is something that could be disagreed on. And I think if you want to be a neoclassical theist, you probably should disagree on it to avoid certain arguments from like perfections of being or divine simplicity, right? And the way you would do that is you might be able to affirm that there is like a capacity for change in a thing, but you would just deny that like potential being exists, right? Joe Schmid has a paper responding to the first way from Dr. Edward Fazer, where he articulates a way of holding to change, where you don't get the being arises from non-being problem, but also you don't have to affirm potential being and the act potency existing. But yeah, thank you guys. Please do like and subscribe. All right. So hopefully the screen here is visible enough. Oh wait, I can zoom in like this as well, actually. Okay, perfect. By the way, this is only a rough rendition of the indeterminate collapse. The reason for that is because I don't. I think you could change around and wiggle around with some of the language here, and I just made it before the live stream. I think it's fine to just work off like this basic rendition of it. With that being said, of course, the the grammar here is appalling. So then you get to the conclusion here. So step three is just a conclusion from these first two steps, which we just established. Now, if anyone in the chat or anything wants to disagree with one of these 2 points, feel free to, and we can go back over the justification for those premises. But for now, we'll reason towards the fact that that reaches towards this conclusion, right? So you got the if God's will is indeterminate, then his will does not describe his contingent effects. If P therefore Q, God's will is indeterminate P. So therefore here we get Q, right? Okay, good. So then step four, some people actually, some more smarter people, I would say, some more intelligent folks that have attempted to respond to this argument have disagreed more with step four here, or premise three it is in the original argument. And that is that if God knows that certain contingent truths are actual, then he knows this in virtue of knowing some content in himself that describes or designates or represents his effects. Now, perhaps you might try to take an extrinsic account of God's knowledge or something like that, which someone that I've actually been talking to about this has been attempting to do. And I think it's the most promising way to get around this argument, but I still don't think it works, and I might explain later in the video. But for now, we're just working with the way that Aquinas himself and others represent God's way of knowing things, right? So, under divine simplicity, God has to know all contingent truths, all things, in virtue of simply knowing his unchangeable and immutable divine essence, himself, right? And you might be asking me, well, Thomas Apologia, why is it that people that believe in divine simplicity or immutability even would have to articulate God's knowledge like that? Couldn't God just like import something outside of himself or da 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 da? Well, here's why, right? So either you could say God knows all things in virtue of knowing himself. So on this view, you can still affirm that God doesn't change, and yet he knows contingent things. Seems like a win-win for divine simplicity and immutability, right? So we'll just put here, God unchangeably knows all things. I can't be asked to correct the spelling there anyway. Okay, so then on another view, you might say, well, God knows all things in virtue of importing a relation of something outside of himself. Perhaps that might be another view, or perhaps God's knowledge in knowing himself or knowing his own will. Perhaps God changes, but these seem to be some of the options on the table for now. And the divine simplist doesn't want to go with this option because, according to divine simplicity, that would mean that God changes. So the only way for God to know contingent things without God looking at them, realizing them, and then knowing them, right, would be in virtue of knowing himself. So where do we get the problem here? Well, in this first conclusion that we have, it says that in God, his will doesn't describe, represent, or designate any of his contingent effects. Okay? So if that's going to be the case, then when we get here and we want to say, well, the way that God knows contingent truths is because, well, God knows it because that's maybe where his will terminates, or God knows what he causes and he upholds all these things in being. Well, where God's will terminates, or the information of what he upholds in being, it's going to be one of two things, which is why I've created this box down here. It's either going to be internal to God, which means that it will be unchangeable and it will be necessary, or it's going to be external to God. External things to God could change, but they can't be predicated of God or identical to him. So let's say you want to put God's knowledge here, or even the way by which he comes to know things. So let's say the terminus of his will on some models, etc. Right? You get the basic gist of what I'm trying to communicate there. Well, then, because it's internal to God, it's going to be unchangeable and necessary. And it doesn't matter how many scholastic distinctions that you want to make here. It doesn't matter if you want to make 1, 2, 3 scholastic distinctions to try to get your way out of it. You're either going to move this right here from in this box, you're either going to keep it in there, or you're going to move it into this box here. That's external, because they're mutually exclusive, it being either internal or external to God. And the problem is that under divine simplicity, if it's internal, it's unchangeable and necessary. And if it's external, well, what might be the problem if God's knowledge is external, if it's outside of him? Well, it can't be predicated of God or identical to him. So I think like a minimal way of understanding knowledge that we could use here is that knowledge in at least almost all models of knowledge is going to at least bottom out at it being some internal representation or reflection of a reality, right? Because if it's not internal, then it can't truly be said of that being to possess it. And if it doesn't reflect some reality, then that means it's not going to be true knowledge. It's not actually going to represent what it sets out to depict, right? So if you try moving this into this box here, the problem that you're going to end up getting then is that you can't actually say that it is God's knowledge, right? So let's take, for example, maybe Cambridge properties we could put into this box, or like the property that God is a creator, right? Now, according to divine simplicity, we don't want to say that God is a creator is an actual property of God, under that doctrine at least, because otherwise, then when God creates, God gains some new extrinsic relation that he has, or some new relation that he has to other things. And under divine simplicity, you don't really want to say God gains properties, relations, da 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 da, da, right? You want to say God is unchangeable in every sense, right? Well, then that just means that when we say God is a creator, we're not saying that God gains something in him under divine simplicity, but rather it's that there might be a mixed relation of us to God, so that it's we say it on the part of us virtually that God is a creator. Right? Perhaps you might say something to that effect, right? Now, if that's the case, then when you move God's knowledge into here, you can't really say that God actually has that knowledge, right? So It's a no-go zone to move God's knowledge into this external box. But no matter which way you try to get out of this argument, no matter how many distinctions you try to use, it's either going to be in one of these two boxes, or maybe partly in one and partly in the other, but both have their equal problems in the boxes, right? So that's how we get this premise. If God knows that certain contingent truths are actual, then he knows this in virtue of knowing some content in himself that describes them. Da, 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 right? And the issue is that according to this premise here, God's will doesn't actually describe them. So we get a contradiction, which means God does not know his contingent effects. And I think that this is a very big problem for divine simplicity. And I might go over a few potential answers to this problem in a minute, but let's take a look at the chat and see if anyone has anything they'd like to add to this. What do you mean by in virtue of knowing himself? So when we say in virtue of knowing himself, we're not saying that God looks at a thing, well, under divine simplicity, that is. They're not saying that God looks at a thing, realizes it, and then comes to know it, or anything like that, or that God even imports something outside of himself to himself, right? Rather, what divine simplists mean by this is that the way that God knows about other truths outside of himself, or the way he knows, is just through simply knowing himself, right? So think of the fact that God, under divine simplicity, causally upholds everything in creation, including this Lynx can of deodorant, including this cocoa butter, including um, this TV remote, etc. Well, if that's the case, then, well, surely God is going to know what he's causing, right? Surely there's going to be some information internal to God that lets him know what he's causing. Well, point of this argument is to say, we've already established that that information can't be internal to God. So rather than the providential collapse, where someone is saying, oh, well, if God's will is indeterminate, then because God has no contrastive explanations, there's nothing in God that designates his effects, therefore God has no intentions for his effects, as Joe Schmid might articulate in some way in his paper. This one is actually just trying to argue that, look, even if you want to equivocate on what we really mean by intentionality there to escape that problem, here is a problem where you get this direct sort of contradiction where God just can't know any contingent facts whatsoever, right? Because there's no information in God. So let's run it through this again, right? Let's say you want to say, yes, well, God does know these contingent facts because God knows his will, and God's will contains this information, or it contains something that tells God what he's willing, and thus God can know all things in knowing himself. God is unchangeable, therefore God doesn't have to change in order to know all things. Okay, good. But when we say that God wills these things and that information is somehow accessible to God, is that information in this box, the internal one, or in this box, the external one? If you put it in the external one, God can't know that information, right? Because under divine simplicity, he can't import these relations from other things to himself, because then he's gaining these new relations, etc. However, if you put it in the other box, the internal box on the left-hand side, then, well, because every predication to God is going to be necessary and unchangeable, according to ADS, then that means that so will God's knowledge of his effects, and thus what he represents in his knowledge is also going to be necessary, because his knowledge won't be able to fail. So then you just get this issue of how do we get contingency and how do we have divine simplicity as well. Now, there might be a few possible solutions to this. You could just deny God's immutability, right? You could just say, hey, I'm going to be a neoclassical theist now. That might be a way to get around it. You might just say, you know what, this necessitarianism thing isn't that bad, and bite the bullet. So you might say creation is necessary. Or you might say that maybe we really like the mereology of divine simplicity. I don't think that it's intuitive to say that, like, take a neoclassical account of how God doesn't have parts. I don't like that. But I still want to say God doesn't have parts. What should I do? Well, maybe you might take like a really weird view and just like try and say, well, maybe some of God's like formalities could change, but God is simple because they're identical to him. Maybe you might take like a really weird view like that. Let's call it neo-Scotism. It would be very strange of a view for someone to create. However, I just thought of it, so maybe some people might end up creating something strange like that. But those are some potential possible answers to the problem. But at least as I understand under Catholicism, it's going to be difficult for us to hold to the dogmas of the church that God is immutable and that God knows contingent facts. You might want to maybe create a different account of immutability and ad hocly interpret some of these councils, but that seems to be one of my biggest doubts with regards to Catholicism in general. Now, I have had some people give me some interesting takes on this argument and attempting to reconcile that. So one way is there's actually a very smart Christian that messaged me, and we've gone back and forth a little bit on this. And one way is maybe saying that God knows things via extrinsic relations, right? So maybe there are these extrinsic relations which are identical to God's essence, and the terminus of each relation changes, right? Now, the issue that I see with that one is we just rerun the same argument. Well, where does the terminus fit into, right? Because it's either going to be in this box or this box. And that seems to me to be mutually exclusive, and that seems to be a very big problem. Because if you force the terminus of those relations into that box on the right hand side there, then unfortunately, God's not going to have access to the information of where his relations may terminate, right? These extrinsic relations. Or perhaps you might want to put it on the side of that it's internal to God. Well, then you're just going to go back to the necessariness of it, and you're going to get a modal collapse again, right? So let me just make sure that the chat is following me along on this one. Thank you. It makes sense. Thank you. Thank you. Is there a way to contact you? You can contact me on Discord. So it should be apology. I believe it's 7 or _7. It's one of those. But that is how you can contact me. Now, is there anyone else in the comments section that wants to ask any questions about the argument that might be a bit confused? This made me realize I need to get better at theology. Well, it's more like a really deep philosophical investigation on it, but I get what you mean. Um, Most of this though isn't stuff, to be fair to you, that's been like published. Like this is an argument I made up on myself. Like I don't expect people to instantly know it. However, I want more people to know about it so that then either someone can come along and refute that argument, and I can be like, "Oh, someone saved the day. I can be a bit more free in my investigation of theology here." Or maybe this just shows that, God's immutability really is incompatible with his knowing of contingent facts about the actual world. And if that's the case, then, maybe neoclassical theism is true. Or maybe it's best to remain agnostic on this like I am at the moment.
right? And I don't blame people for not directly responding to this yet, because it's something that's new, something that's going to take time. I'm not going to go up to random people that believe in divine simplicity and just press them aggressively on this, because I don't think that that's right to do. Well, I saw the title. My man is finally coming to this understanding. I think, Jupe, you're from the Discord server, aren't you? I I think we still probably have a lot of disagreements with how we put certain things, but um, I'm not saying that I am becoming a neoclassical theist. I'm saying that I'm on the fence between these views. Who knows? You could even solve this problem by being a necessitarian, and then you could still keep simplicity, right? Obviously, under most views of Christianity, you're not fitting into like that orthodox box to be put into. But yeah, wouldn't some form of Neoplatonism deny this? But I won't agree with it anyways. Um, As far as I'm concerned, at least I think in like Islamic Neoplatonist traditions, I don't think that they say that the one has knowledge. I think they give that to the divine intellect. But I'm not all too clued up on Neoplatonism, so I might be completely wrong there, guys. I'm not the most knowledgeable of them all. Um, Jupiter's the guy with the red. Yeah, I think he is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's Ali. Yeah, on the Discord server. What books would you suggest me, which at the same time help me to develop the semantics in this topic? Well, you know what? Something that really did help me a lot is looking into scholastic philosophy, right? Or just Aristotelian metaphysics and philosophy, because I didn't realize how much language, how much stuff I was really missing out on and defining before I started going into that. And I'm grateful that I have studied at least a tiny bit of that. I'm not the best with Aristotelianism, but at least we know a tiny bit of that. So, for example, um, I think one book, I haven't read this book for a while now, but Thomistic Philosophy, Volume 2, Metaphysics by Henry Grenier. This was a pretty decent book, but maybe you might be even more beginner, in which case, maybe you might want to read either a book called ABCs of Scholastic Philosophy, or you might want to read Scholastic Metaphysics by Edward Fazer. Now, I really liked this one because I think it breaks it down very simply and it makes it much easier to learn. But honestly, just getting into terms with the definitions of these things is really going to help you, especially with regards to metaphysics. I am the Lorenzo that doesn't talk much in Discord. No, I don't think he is the UK known Lorenzo Astra. I don't think that's the same Lorenzo. There's two Lorenzos. I think both are in the Discord. So there's two Lorenzos in the Discord. But anyways, so Scholastic Metaphysics by Edward Fazer is one of the best books. Yeah, I really like it. A lot of people like sometimes have bad stuff to say about it, but I think for a beginner book it's really good. I mean, you could read ABCs of Scholastic Philosophy as well. And also something that really helped me is Bernard Wallner has something called I have that one. Can you bring a little closer the green book so I can take a screenshot? That's it there. So ABCs of Scholastic Philosophy, also another good book. You might also want to maybe read into the actual metaphysics of Aristotle. I've got the metaphysics somewhere in here, but I've got a lot of books down there. I need to clean it up. So those are a couple books that you might want to read. But oh yeah, I was saying that Bernard Warner also has a decent book. It's called I think it's a dictionary of scholastic philosophy, right? Let me try it. Bernard Warner. There it is. This is pretty decent because it gives you the definitions of all these terms. If someone says a term that you don't understand, most of the time you can just flick to it in this book and it will tell you. So, like, let's say the term form gets used with like matter and form, and you're like, oh man, what does form mean? That's like really difficult to understand. Well, in this book, he actually has a definition of form where he talks about it with regards to like essences and blah blah blah, right? He gives you some pretty good definitions of these terms. And I think that's also a PDF there as well, so you might be able to download it, which is pretty good. The only reason we disagree on ADS is probably because we have a different view of what equality is. What would you recommend a Christian to start in, scholastic, analytic, or I haven't read very much continental philosophy, so I can't give you the biggest take on it. I prefer like analytic guys like Josh Rasmussen, Alexander Proust, people like that. I even enjoy watching Joe Schmidt, even though he's an agnostic. I really like his videos. He came out of a really good video today on causal finitism. Uh, where is it? Majesty of Reason. Shout out to Joe Schmidt. He's got a really cool channel. Here it is, causal finitism and Grim Reaper paradoxes. If you're interested on like things like the Kalam cosmological, the contingency argument, etc., and you're interested, did the universe have a beginning? This is some like very high level stuff here, right? And Alexander Proust and Josh Rasmussen are awesome as well. What is causal finitism? Causal finitism is just the view that the causal history of everything is finite, right? So let's say Thomas Apologia was caused to exist by his parents, who were caused to exist by their parents, so on and so on and so on, who may have been caused to exist by a flying rock in space or something crazy like that, right? Well, at some point, either you're going to say that causal chain keeps on going on an infinite number of times to infinity, you know, maybe it just never ends. There was no beginning of the universe. Or maybe there was a beginning of the universe. Maybe there was a first cause in this chain. And the view that says that there is a finite, there is not an infinite, a finite number of causes in the causal history of everything is what we call causal finitism, right? Now, you don't have to believe that causal finitism is demonstrable, right, to try to prove theism, right? You don't actually have to do that. Like, Josh Rasmussen actually just goes, you know what, forget arguing that the causal history of everything must be finite. Well, what's the explanation of contingent things at all? It can't be more contingent things. It's like saying, why does this chicken exist? Well, let's posit more chickens, and then that explains why all chickens exist. Well, no, that doesn't. Like, for example, why does Thomas Apologia exist? Thomas Apologia is 10 years old. Well, maybe he's 100 years old. That explains even more why he exists. In an infinite number of years old. Doesn't explain why Thomas Apologia exists. Same way an infinite causal regress might not explain why contingent things at all exist, right? So that's the way that Josh Rasmussen goes about it in some of his work, which is interesting. And Aquinas, of course, doesn't go for the whole accidons, causal chains need to be infinite. Aquinas more just says that only per se causal series must be infinite. And then from there, you have to argue that like the causal history of everything is like a per se causal chain, similar to like if you have like the links on a chain, if you cut off the first link, the whole chain falls down, right? That might be a per se causal chain. You have a cup of coffee on a desk, which is held up by the floorboards, which is held up by the earth. That's a per se causal chain, right? It's a per se causal chain is when each of the causes in that chain doesn't have the causality actually in themselves, but rather they have it through another, right? And if you take away that first cause, then the whole chain just falls apart. And that's how people like Aquinas get to, well, there must be this first cause, right? So that's a whole different route we're going to from this video. But I wanted to just point out this argument here and the modal collapse in general, and some questions that we can ask to anyone who tries to solve it using just scholastic distinctions. And I think you only really need to ask two questions. Question number one is this distinction internal? And question number two, does the distinction designate its effect? Okay, let's say that someone wants to make a distinction between God's primary object of willing and God's secondary object of willing. Okay, is God's act of willing internal? Let's say his secondary act of willing, right? Yes, it is internal. Okay, and we can put it in this box here. Um, act of willing object. Okay, so then that's going to result again in the modal collapse. Okay, well, maybe we might want to avoid the modal collapse. Maybe they might say, no, it doesn't result in the modal collapse because just because God's act of willing is internal to him, it doesn't mean maybe that God's act designates what he's willing, right? Perhaps God's act is causally indeterminate. Okay, so then does the distinction designate its effect? Does this thing designate its effect? Well, perhaps not. So how do we respond to that part there? Well, that's what this argument here is for, right? This argument is for anyone that tries to take the biconditional solution to the modal collapse, the solution where we say that there is causal indeterminacy for God's will, right? That's what this argument addresses. Because then you get all sorts of problems, right? You get a providential problem, because normally what we want to say about intentionality is that it's something internal to that thing. It might be some property of something internal to that thing that motivates it to choose to do one thing rather than another. Well, if you don't have a contrasted explanation for why God chooses to do one thing rather than another, which definitionally takes place when we have indeterminacy in causal chains, right? If you want to say that, then, well, if God's will is indeterminate and it doesn't have a contrastive explanation, how's he going to have intentionality, right? Now, that's on that account of intentionality. Perhaps someone might want to say, I don't define intentionality as some internal property that motivates you to choose something rather than another. Maybe I just define intentionality as that whilst I could have done this number of options, I did this option. That's the way Stephen Nemesh, at least, Dr. Stephen Nemesh, at least, used to describe intentionality when he was a classical theist, right? And that's the way he got around this providential collapse. Well, okay, you might get around the providential collapse by using that, or maybe you might take an extrinsic account of intentionality. But can you get around this argument here? This is the argument that I think is. I honestly don't think that it can be refuted. I wouldn't have gone agnostic on this belief if I did, and I've been searching for it for a while. Because, look, if you do say that his will is indeterminate, and then you do go along with embracing the conclusions of indeterminacy, that his will isn't going to describe or designate his contingent effects in any sense, it's eventually going to bottom out at the conclusion that God doesn't know his contingent effects, which is going to be very problematic because no one, especially in the Christian tradition, wants to say God does not know his contingent effects, right? And that's why I think this is, in my opinion, probably the most powerful argument against divine simplicity. So these two questions here can be asked about any distinction that is offered to try to refute the modal collapse. Live again finally. What God wills with respect to creatures is willed by him with a reason, either the reason of his goodness or another derived from it. Okay, exactly, right? So if we're saying that God's will has some reason for its effect, and we're saying that this reason at least depicts why one effect should come about rather than another effect, that it's contrasted in its nature, right? Then we would have to deny that God's will is causally indeterminate. But the issue is that causal indeterminacy is just when prior to the effect, the cause is indifferent in its state, yet the effects could be different. Well, that's definitionally what we're trying to do here when we're trying to avoid the modal collapse itself. So we're going to have a big problem there, right? Okay. He argues for the falsehood of Grim Reaper's paradox, premises / validity from the falsehood of its conclusions. Yeah, it's a very interesting video on modal collapse sorry, not modal collapse, on the Grim Reaper paradoxes by Schmidt. Thomas, would you say reducing consciousness to matter is logically incoherent? I've not gone deep into the philosophy of mind. I think if you ask Josh Rasmussen, he'd at least say it's not intuitive because like he has this like weird thing where he like grabs things and then he goes, well, I have this piece of reality here and this piece of reality here. It doesn't seem intuitive to me, Joe, if we combined them to make consciousness. That's sort of how he sounds when he tries to describe it to me. I agree with the intuition, but again, like there are like refutations of it. Like Joe Schmidt offered one in a video where he was talking to him, where he said, "Well, when we bake a cake, we combine things that aren't spongy together, and we get something spongy, right?" Okay. God's will is not indeterminate in itself; rather, it is eternally and immutably fixed on what he wills, including contingent effects. What makes an effect contingent is not that God's will is undetermined, but that God freely wills it to be so. Okay, and this is where I think that most people, when responding to this argument, are not working off of the definition of, I think my chat has gone there, are not working under the definition of causal indeterminacy that we're actually using here, right? So at the start of the video, I said, when we're talking about causal indeterminacy, we're not referring to that the cause is inadequate to cause its effects or that it couldn't on its own cause these effects, da 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 da, right? It we're not saying that. What we're saying is just that the cause could be indifferent in its current state, however, its effects could be different, right? And definitionally, you have to say that that is the case if you want to say that God can produce contingent effects but also be simple, because you are fundamentally saying God is unchangeable, but God's effects changeable, right? So then this argument, all it does is it examines that, well, causally indeterminate things don't have contrastive explanations for their effects. Because if there were a contrastive explanation for why one effect comes about rather than another effect, let's say you have world one and world two. If there is an explanation for why world one comes about rather than world two coming about, right, then God's will is no longer going to be causally indeterminate because you have something which is indiscernible, unchangeable, and necessary that says God is going to cause X rather than Y. Well, if X necessarily designates some Y, then Y is necessarily going to be the case, right? That's the basic inference that is being used there. Okay, so that's why when we go here, these seem to be the only questions that you need to ask someone that attempts to make some sort of a scholastic distinction here. Is this distinction still internal to God? Okay, if God's will is still internal to him, you still get this part of the problem, that it's necessary. Okay,
well, maybe God's necessary will doesn't actually um, pick out, it doesn't contain any information in itself that says X will be the cause. Okay, well, then we just go back up to this argument, which is the indeterminate collapse, because then you're embracing indeterminacy in God's will, which is the only way to solve the modal collapse. Is it just me, or does this argument seem to simply presuppose that in order to know contingent things, God's will must contain a representational concept like humans? So it's not saying that it needs to be like humans, but it's supposed to be broad enough that it needs some information about it in any sense, right? Because the information that depicts not P isn't going to be the same information that depicts P, right? Otherwise, God's knowledge with regards to this current world would be indifferent with regards to some different possible world, right? And that wouldn't make any sense because then God wouldn't know which of the possible worlds is the actual world, right? So all you need to do is say, look, maybe you don't like the word describes. Maybe you don't like the word represents. Maybe you don't like the word designates. But any way that you want to articulate this, God is going to have to know something about this via some internal reflection or representation or designation of himself towards some reality. And that's what knowledge is. So if that's the case, then you put the knowledge in one of these two boxes, right? Okay. If knowledge is in this internal box, it's necessary, and thus what it represents is also going to be necessary. If knowledge is in this external box, what is it going to be? Well, it doesn't need to be necessary, but then you can't actually say that God has that knowledge, right? And the issue is that these two boxes, internal and external, are mutually exclusive. It has to go into one of the two. So, how does God know his contingent effects? Well, perhaps he has some information, representation, or designation. Perhaps there's something about God, maybe it's his will, that tells him, hey, these contingent things exist, and you only have to know that in virtue of knowing yourself. Great. That piece of information there, that thing there, is it internal to God? If the answer to that question is yes, then it's necessary. If the answer is no, then God can't actually access that without changing. That's the point. So, what I wanted to do here is, no offense to Scholastic Answers, by the way. I think this guy has a really good channel. I think he's doing really great things. But perhaps we can look at some of these clips here. Now, I saw these clips a long time ago. I think I watched a tiny bit, like a minute before this stream began. But I think that we can just apply this rule of questioning to these videos here, and hopefully it should be able to show that the indeterminate
It
collapse
follows that
works.
those second.
So
Can we?
hopefully everyone can hear that. Pretty sure Prima Pars answers this in question 19. Yeah, Aquinas. So when Aquinas answers this in question 19, okay, this is actually good because what Aquinas does in question 19 is he distinguishes between, let's say, suppositional necessity and absolute necessity, right? And he says that God wills contingent effects is suppositionally necessary. So, for example, if Thomas Apologia is sat down, he's necessarily sat down, but he could stand up, right? And I just did to show you. So let's go to Summa Theologiae in Pars. New Advent should be good enough for this. I know a lot of people like Aquinas.cc, but I think New Advent should be good. God's will. Okay. Which article was it again? Does God necessarily will whatever he wills? Probably that article.
I believe it is. Yes, okay. So we can read Aquinas's answer here. Okay, can everyone see? All right. Okay, okay. So it was Article 4. Okay, it looks like he says it in this article here, but we'll go to Article 4 as well. Okay, I answer that we must hold that. Oh, what's gone on there? I answer that we must hold that the will of God is the cause of things, and that he acts by the will, and not, as some have supposed, by a necessity of his nature. This can be shown in three ways. Okay, first, from the order itself of active causes, since both intellect and nature act for an end, as proved, the natural agent must have the end and the necessary means predetermined for it by some higher intellect, as the end and definite movement is predetermined for the arrow by the archer. Hence, the intellectual and voluntary agent must precede the agent that acts by nature. Hence, since God is the first in the order of agents, he must act by will and intellect. Okay, now that's a good argument. But what is Aquinas responding to here? If you're saying that he's responding to the modal collapse, I think that you've missed the mark. And here's why. What Aquinas is arguing here is that God isn't determined to act by external things. And that can be true, and the modal collapse can still follow, because the modal collapse isn't saying that something outside of God determines him to act a certain way, but the modal collapse is saying that, and again, I'm not saying the modal collapse itself is the best argument. I'm saying that these extensions of the modal collapse help us to get to where the problems really lie. The modal collapse just says that if God is necessary and his will designates his effects, wait, let's say, and his necessary and unchanged, immutable will designates his effects, then his effects necessary. Those are two different questions. So I don't think in Article 4 he addresses it. I think in Article 3 is where he actually attempts to address it. But in my opinion, and I love St. Thomas Aquinas, the people on this channel know because I quote him a lot. I quote some of the scholastics. In my opinion, I don't think that he properly addresses this in Article 3. But let me just take a look. Sure, but in the three acts of interior life, Lagrange applies the principle St. Thomas uses here to the modal collapse. Okay, well, I'd love to see what Lagrange says to this, but from as far as we've demonstrated so far, Article 4 doesn't address the modal collapse sufficiently. So then let's look at Article 3, because I think Article 3 actually is the problem. So, okay, here it is. I answer that there are two ways in which a thing is to be necessary, namely absolutely and by supposition. We judge a thing to be absolutely necessary from the relation of the terms, as when the predicate forms part of the definition of the subject. Thus, it is absolutely necessary that man is an animal. Now, in modern philosophy, we might refer to this as something like a rigid designation, right? That H2O is water, something like that. Now, with regards to the modal collapse, the type of necessity that we're talking about just needs to be metaphysical necessity, right? Which technically Aquinas doesn't really talk about too much there, but you can maybe infer it from absolute necessity that he talks about there. But we're just referring to something called metaphysical necessity, which is just to say that in all possible worlds, this thing exists. If I wanted to be fancy and like, all uh, analytic about it, I could be for all possible worlds, X exists, blah blah blah. But we're just talking to the audience here. We don't have to be super technical. Okay. So when we're talking about metaphysical necessity, that's what we're applying to the mode of collapse, right? For example, 2 plus 2, some people will say, is metaphysically necessary. There's no possible world in which 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4, right? There's no possible world in which it equals 5. So you might say that might be something that's metaphysically necessary. It obtains across all possible worlds, you might say. And so might God's existence, right? But if you believe in divine simplicity, you don't want to say that God's properties could be various across possible worlds or different across possible worlds, right? If you believe in divine simplicity, you might want to say, well, God's properties are indiscernible, they don't change, and they're necessary, at least according to like classical theistic conceptions of divine simplicity. So when we're talking about the modal collapse, this is the relevant type of necessity that we're talking to. Because let's say someone wants to make the objection of the modal collapse. Let's say like in one, God is or God is identical to his will. God is necessary. I don't believe this is a good version of the modal collapse, but it's a really basic one to help people think. Therefore, God's will is necessary. Okay, okay, good. So then when you have that argument, the type of necessity that's being spoken about, let's say Aquinas wants to solve it by doing this, right? So you keep reading. Aquinas says, thus it is absolutely necessary. It's the same when the subject forms part of the predicate. That's the absolutely necessary number. In this way, it is not necessary that Socrates sits. Wherefore, it is not necessary absolutely, though it may be so by supposition. For granted that he is sitting, so if Socrates is sitting, he must necessarily sit, as long as he is sitting, accordingly as to things willed by God. So Aquinas is saying, you're using the wrong type of necessity here. You should be talking about suppositional necessity. So he might just redo the argument as, well, God is absolutely necessary, but maybe God's will, when we say it's necessary here, suppositionally is necessary, right? Okay. Excuse the spelling and the typing, guys. I am diagnosed as dyslexic, so it's fine. But that's the thing. With this argument, no one's, in these two premises, no one's talking about suppositional necessity. We're talking about metaphysical necessity. So when you get to this conclusion here, ugh, this is a really bad version of words, and I can't be bothered to spell correct this. But therefore, God's will is metaphysically necessary, right? Now, someone like Christopher Tomaszewski just says, yeah, this premise is fine. It's fine to say that God's will is metaphysically necessary, but God's will is metaphysically necessary doesn't get you to conclusion star, which he puts in his paper. That therefore, therefore, God's act of creation is metaphysically necessary. So Tomaszewski wants to say this doesn't imply this. Well, how might someone want to say that conclusion one implies conclusion star, right? Well, the way that someone might want to say that is by using something called like rigid designation. And the way that Tomaszewski gets around this in his paper, right? Because basically, if you say that, well, God's will is necessary, but God's will contains the information that it's a will of a creative act. And that can't change. No information internal to it can change. So God's will must be an act of creation. But Tomaszewski will just say that God's will is an act of creation isn't designated by God's will itself, but it's designated by the act of creation. So then God's will doesn't actually contain the information in it that designates its effect, right? And that's how Tomaszewski gets around it. But notice that when you do that, you're using causal indeterminacy. So then we just go back to the indeterminate collapse right there. Right? So that's how we get there. All right. So that's Aquinas's thoughts on it. Summa Theologiae Prima Pars, question 19, Article 3, and even Article 4, which I don't think Article 4 is really what attempts to address it. I think he's attempting to do so in Article 3, which is titled whether whatever God wills, he wills necessarily. Okay. And I even have some clips lined up here that we can do. Anabolic steroids triggers dyslexia. I've been dyslexic from when I was way young. I don't promote anabolic steroids. I agree with a lot of people in the fitness sphere that that is going to significantly shorten your life and it's going to take years off of your life. So don't do it. The health effects will be terrible for you. Any sort of performance enhancing drugs. It's not worth it. You got to train harder than last time. You got to be like Greg Doucette and train harder than last time. But you also got to live longer than last time, okay, guys? All right. Let's see what else we have here. One thing I don't get is you said God's knowledge is a representation of some reality, but how can that be if knowledge, identical to being, has zero commonality with that reality? Okay, so in any way that you talk about knowledge, let's just get some like things straight. One, it needs to be internal to God, right? Otherwise, it's not actually God's knowledge. And two, it would have to represent, depict, or say something about reality that it's trying to represent. Now, with divine simplicity, that's a good question. I'm kind of agnostic on divine simplicity, so maybe the onus to answer that question might be on someone that actually is more positive on it than me. Maybe you might want to do so by introducing some virtual distinctions, da 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 da. But I don't think that there's too much of a problem with saying, look, the way that God's will, or sorry, maybe the way that God's knowledge is representational of the world, but it still is identical to God, is, well, God's will contains information of what it causes, and that will is identical to God, so therefore God can know those things. But that's exactly what the indeterminate collapse is trying to show, is, not so good. Okay? Abdul says, this is so interesting. Thank you, Abdul. Pretty sure Astro made an article on this. So I think I've actually got a video here from Astro. Okay, good. So someone asks here, can we use traditional Thomists to attack modern arguments against divine simplicity, like the modal collapse argument? Thoughts on Christopher Tomaszewski? So Christopher Tomaszewski is the guy whose work I've quoted a couple times in the stream, and I think that his response is the best response that actually works, but I don't actually think it works against further extensions of this. So let's take a look here.
Use traditional Thomists to attack modern arguments against divine simplicity, like the modal collapse arguments. Thoughts on Christopher Tomaszewski, Joe Schmidt, and Ryan Mullins?
I think this video will be taken down because of my thoughts on Ryan Mullins. But yeah, to answer your first question, yeah. So modal collapse objection is already answered in traditional Thomists. So you don't need to go and search for papers. Like I've seen people who go on Google say, "Oh, how to refute modal collapse." Bro, you don't need that. You don't even need to read any of classical Thomists from like Baroque era. You just need to go to Lagrange, question 19, article 3. There you're gonna find an answer to modal collapse. He replies to modal collapse in his God, his existence, and his nature as well. And then Grenier replies to modal collapse in his section on the divine will, book 3 on operative attributes of God. So if you want English sources, just read those. If you want Latin sources, then go read Moses' questions. And then, so there's a position, and that's the position of Kite, and it's some Thomists think that it's problematic, but I heard that there was a cardinal in 19th century, and he wrote a section in his book to prove that Kite's position was not problematic. But ignoring that, the traditional response is that, so how do you define divine freedom? So divine freedom, in Thomists define it as, it's the very necessary act of God. So the free act of God is not a super-added act to the divine essence. It's just a very necessary act of God. But that act has a non-necessary termination outside God himself. And that's because God's divine will does not depend on secondary objects. Because if it did, then God's will would be essentially dependent on something which is infinitely inferior to himself.
So notice that this is, firstly, what we're speaking of here is a reason why the terminus of God's will is not necessary. That's good. But that reason doesn't actually address a refutation of the modal collapse itself, because it's not addressing, well, how God's will can be necessary and contain the information of the terminus, but yet the terminus itself not be necessary. Because if an X necessarily designates some Y, it's going to follow that Y is necessary.
So God's object of the divine volition is specified by his primary object of the divine volition, which is his divine essence. So we say that God wills himself or his own essence of absolute necessity, but he doesn't need to will secondary objects because he doesn't need them because his goodness is already perfect without them.
Okay, did you catch that there? That's not actually addressing the modal collapse. And this isn't like me trying to offend Astro or Christian Wagner. I think they're great guys. But I think that this misses the mark because you're not addressing the modal collapse. What you're doing is you're saying God doesn't need to cause X because God is free or something or da 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 da. The modal collapse doesn't make the argument that external things influence God to have to choose a certain way. It's saying that God internally, if you're saying everything about him is necessary and that in him he designates his effect and he's unchangeable, then that means his effect is going to be necessary as well. Otherwise, his will would just fail to come about. So this, I think, is just a bit of like, I'm not sure if it's intentional or not, but just a bit of sleight of hand here, where instead of addressing the argument, we're changing it to something that it's not, and then we're putting our 2 cents in there. I don't think that that works at all. Because the modal collapse isn't saying that external things to God must make God choose to do X. It's saying what I just said earlier on before.
If he did need them, then he would have to will them in order to attain the end. But we know that God doesn't need to attain the end that he himself is with those secondary objects because his goodness is the very essence.
And notice the distinction again between the primary object, which is God's divine essence, and the secondary object, which might be these contingent things, which might be Thomas Apologia existing, this cocoa butter existing, etc., etc. Right? So when someone makes this distinction between the primary object and the secondary object, what are the two questions that we were talking about earlier, guys? Is the distinction internal? Does the distinction designate its effect? Okay, so let's say we have God's act of willing, and we're talking about the secondary object here. Is it internal to God? Yes. Or maybe no. Well, if it's not internal to God, then it's not God's act of willing, is it? It's something else. So I don't think anyone would say that anyway. So yes, it is internal. But anything according to divine simplicity that is internal to God is unchangeable and necessary. So how do we then get out of this one? Well, Christopher Tomaszewski, in his paper, Joe Schmid has realized this, other people have realized this, is that the way that you get out of this is by saying, well, does the distinction designate its effect? Well, perhaps it's causally indeterminate. Well, if it's causally indeterminate, you don't have to say that the act of willing contains the information that designates that its effect will be that way. But again, if that's the case, then you run into my argument here, the indeterminate collapse. Okay, so let's keep watching the rest of this video.
So he doesn't participate in any goodness. He just is goodness. So the divine will does not depend on secondary objects in any way. And from this, it follows that those secondary objects are willed freely, not necessarily. And so the same, one and the same necessary. This is why St. Thomas says that God does not will himself by one act and creatures by another act, but that by one and the same necessary act, he wills himself necessarily and creatures freely. He wills himself necessarily because the divine will is specified by the divine essence itself, but he wills creatures freely because those objects do not specify God's act. And the same applies.
So God wills freely because there's nothing outside of him that makes him have to act that certain way. Modal collapse isn't saying that. It's just saying there's something internal to him that makes it so that he has to act that way. What is that, you ask? Any information in him that describes, designates, or intends towards some effect. And if you want to deny that that's the case, you run into Joe Schmidt's providential collapse, and you run into my indeterminate collapse that I created.
To the divine knowledge. And this is one of our critiques of Monism and their middle knowledge. So both the divine knowledge and the divine will, they're both specified by the primary object. So there's another form of modal collapse which says, oh, suppose that God had created some other universe. So in that sense, it seems that God could have had different knowledge. So his act would essentially change. In reply, we do not say as some authors suggested, oh, that means God's act of knowing and willing are extrinsic to God. No, we just don't say that because we think that act of knowing and willing can in no way be extrinsic. And you can read proofs for this in Aristotle's Metaphysics chapter, book 9, chapter 8, where he proves that willing and knowing are perfections of the agent. So anyways, so when they say, oh, if had God willed differently, had God created differently, then wouldn't that mean that God would have had different knowledge and different acts of willing? You just reply that no, because nobody is claiming that God's act is specified by those secondary objects. And since it is not specified by them, God's...
But again, no one's saying that it has to be specified in that manner, but all people are saying is, well, surely if God wills the secondary objects, the information about the secondary objects is going to be in some manner contained in his will. If you answer no to that question, you get the indeterminate and the providential collapse. You get the collapses collapsing, okay? You just get it. But if you answer yes to that question, the information is contained there. Well, obviously, if God would have willed otherwise, obviously, if God would have known otherwise, his knowledge, his act of willing, etc., would have been different. Because that God knows that Thomas Apologia exists in World 1, and that God knows that Thomas Apologia doesn't exist in World 2, that's not the same knowledge. That can't be designated the same. So that information is going to be cross-world variant.
Secondary objects of his act of knowing and willing can differ, but the act is not going to differ because act is specified by something immutable, which is his essence. So whether God created or not, the act is going to remain the same because he knows and wills the divine essence of absolute necessity.
Okay, that's that video. There was another one. I don't quite remember what the other one was. So we just watched this one, I believe. So we can watch this one as well.
I need to talk to you. We need...
Because it is interesting to see how some of these people answer these arguments. But ultimately, from my perspective, I think that when you use analytical philosophy against some of these scholastic distinctions, not that all of them are fruitless, but when you go down to the core of these things, ultimately we're just making distinctions for distinction's sake, because it doesn't actually solve the problem, it just pushes it a step further. Oh, well, we're not talking about the primary object of God's will, we're talking about the secondary. We just ask the same questions, and you get the same problematic argument. All right. Let's see here. Astro made an article on it. Is the article on Astro's Medium? If it's on his Medium, then that would be good for me to be able to access it. You might be conflating eternal with necessary. God's act of creating is eternal, not necessary. So again, we're not referring to it just being eternal. We're referring to its modality, whether it exists across all possible worlds or not. Now, God's act, God's will, of course, is going to be absolutely metaphysically necessary. But the question is, does that mean that God's act of creation is absolutely necessary? The only way you avoid that conclusion getting towards that second one is if you deny that there is some information that designates which act that act of willing is in the secondary causes. That's the only way that you get there. So no, we're not confusing eternality and necessity. We're talking about modality here. So if you adhere to the argument, you collapse God into modality. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Am I glitching or did you delete Dupe? No, I didn't delete him. I think he deleted his own comment. Thank you for your answer. If we agree that knowledge is an Y, that X is conscious or undergoes, then that entails the thing known by X is what Y is made out of. So that means if God knows knowledge is made out of God, then that's all God knows. So I just think that the way you're using consciousness there isn't a way, like with qualia and maybe things like that, and phenomenological experiences. I don't know if that's the way divine simplists would necessarily do it. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to stillman the way that divine simplists would understand this, and then produce a reductio. Unc, can you please go back to Catholicism? I went to my Catholic church this morning for Mass, okay? I'm not a Catholic myself, but while I'm inquiring, at least I go there. This is an issue that I'm seeking to sort out myself. I'm just trying to be as intellectually honest as possible with you guys so that you know all my doubts and you can know if I find something really pressing. And I think that this is something valuable to contribute to, like the literature on this or other things on this, because it helps people to reach towards truth, these arguments. Is divine simplicity true? Well, my current verdict right now is I'm moving towards, I don't know. I'm more agnostic on the question. Not sure your criticism is valid, Thomas. It at first glance seems to confuse a necessary cause with a necessitating cause. Well, all a necessary cause is just that the cause exists across all possible worlds. Well, then, whether that cause is going to be necessitating or not is just, in all possible worlds, does it contain the information that designates its effect? And if that's the case, it will be necessitating. Why don't you send the email to Chris? Chris Tomaszewski? I don't know. Bro, how can you attend the Catholic Church? Don't you see the contradictions in Vatican III? Who was it that said Vatican III again? Was it oh, what's his name? Cliff. Ask Cliff. Vatican III. That's funny. Okay. Let's watch this second clip now. Maybe he offers something different from the first one.
Okay.
We got you. We got you.
Me, dude.
So how does
but okay. So the way we define freedom in Thomism is active indifference of God's most simple act with regard to several different secondary objects. So to start with, you have to know that acts are specified by their objects. So because when you want to act, you act to, and your act is specified by some object. So for example, let's say that you want to travel to Spain or any place you want, right? Your action has a Spain as its end. Now, if you can travel on your foot, if you can't travel on your foot, you have to take some means by which the end can be accomplished. Like you have to go on plane or on boat or anything. So those are means by which the end, which is going to Spain, is achieved. Now, those are both objects, but one is primary and the other is secondary. So now God likewise has primary and secondary object of the divine volition. So the primary object of the divine volition is the divine essence itself. God wills himself of absolute necessity. God cannot choose not to love himself. It's absolutely necessary, natural for God to love himself. But because God by absolute necessity loves himself, we can show that God's love or goodness can exist without creatures. So God's goodness in no way depends on those secondary.
So I think this is repeating the same thing from first video, but again, this isn't what the modal collapse is. This is addressing another type of argument, right? It's addressing again what Aquinas earlier was saying in Summa Theologiae Prima Pars, question 19, Article 4. But we're talking about the question that he has in Article 3, not Article 4, because this argument is just saying, do external creatures or external things to God cause God to act in a certain way? That's a different argument from the modal collapse, because the modal collapse isn't saying that he's causally determined to do so by something external. No, the modal collapse is just saying that there is something necessary and intrinsic to God that means that he could not be some other way, such that if he designates some effect, that effect must come about. But I'm going to give this the benefit of the doubt and keep watching, see if something different gets talked about.
Objects, which are the creatures or means that are ordered to the divine goodness. And since that's the case, there's no necessity on the part of God's action to necessarily choose these objects, which are called secondary objects. So what we say is that God's freedom is active indifference of God's most simple action, not power, because God never moves from having power to going to act, because God, unlike creatures, has an eternal action, not a temporal action. So we creatures move from having power to act. So our freedom is defined as a potency which is open to different actions. But since God never begins to act, his freedom is not defined as potency in relation to different actions, but action in relation to different objects. So from all eternity, God is an eternal action, and that eternal action can have different secondary objects. Okay, and that's how we say that God is free, because God's act of will does not depend on those secondary objects, but only on the primary object, which is his essence. And this distinction is called action taken entitatively versus action called terminatively. So the action is entitatively necessary because God cannot lack the action, because freedom is perfection. But terminatively, there is no necessity for God's action to terminate at creatures, because there's no necessity for him to will.
Okay, so he just repeats the point towards the end of the video. I don't think I need to say my refutation of that point anymore, because I think by now you guys get the picture on that. All right. Evangelical continuationism is good on you, Unk. Evangelical continuationism? You're gonna have to tell me what you mean by that. Yeah, Cliff Mitchell. Yeah, Vatican III. Oh my goodness. Yeah, the philosopher Chris, have you tried to email it to him? Yes, I have. So his email is something like Christopher Tomaszewski at Baylor.edu, something like that. That's how well I know his email, because I've tried emailing it to him. The problem is, as I'm no longer in university, I no longer have like an academic email. I don't even know if I could have done it with my email prior, but anyway, just trying to email with my Gmail or something like that, I cannot get this email to go through to Tomaszewski. So I attempted to email Tomaszewski. Don't remember if I tried to email Joe Schmid. I think I tried Ryan Mullins, but he has like a weird website inquiry thing, and I just don't think he took my inquiry. That's fine. I tried to email Tomaszewski, Stephen Nemesh, Ryan Mullins. What's his email? If you just search up on the internet, hang on, where is it? Look, it's in my search history. It's in my search history, guys. Yeah, for some reason I must be misspelling his name, but if you spell his name properly and type it on the internet, you'll find like a little like, I don't remember if it was a LinkedIn page or some sort of page. It will have his email on it. Problem was I just couldn't get the emails to go through to him. But that's fine. That's fine. But with that being said, is there any final questions or any videos or anything people want me to react? before I close the stream. I think I've broken this down well enough, but if people want me to explain like one final thing that they just don't get, if they want me to show how something entails something, we can go there for the final part of the stream. Don't be scared, guys. Evangelical continuationism is evangelicals who say the gifts of the Holy Spirit exist today. Okay. I mean, I don't mind continuationism. I just don't agree with the way that every Protestant denomination uses it. Like, I don't believe that speaking in tongues is like a gibberish language. I don't think people should use it that way. I think it makes Christians look kind of foolish as well. And you can read 1 Corinthians 14 to find that out. Thomas, check your server. I can't send the appropriate link in here. Unfortunately, I'm recording with my phone, but afterwards I'll check my server. Have you watched Chris's video with Joe Schmidt? I think I may have a while ago, but I don't remember. Christopher Tomaszewski, Joe Schmidt. Because I do think that Christopher Tomaszewski. Okay, yeah, this is it. This will be an interesting video to react to. If you guys want, I can react to this. But I do actually think that Christopher Tomaszewski sees similar issues to this one. Like, how does Tomaszewski respond to it? So when I was watching some podcasts with Tomaszewski talking about this, um, Tomaszewski basically just said, yeah, that you guys have the same problem too. So he related it back to the like objection to free will, right? So if you say God's will is causally indeterminate, this is, by the way, more with regards to Joe Schmidt's providential collapse, but we'll just roll with this one, right? So then Tomaszewski goes, okay, so you want to say that if God's will is indeterminate, there's no contrastive explanation. Okay, that's true. However, does that mean that God has no intentionality? Well, people that believe in libertarian free will believe that there's causal indeterminacy. So does that mean that you just have that they willed that by luck? The luck objection to free will, because it's arbitrary which of the possible probabilities come about, etc. in libertarian free will, if you take causal indeterminacy. So then Tomaszewski just goes, well, you guys have that same problem with the luck objection to free will. And you might even try and extend this problem to neoclassical theism. So if you go onto my channel, in this video that I made on the indeterministic collapse, just because I wanted to go the extra mile and I didn't want like loads of neoclassical theists dunking on all of the Thomists and stuff, I made this part, a providential collapse for neoclassical theism itself. Yes, that's right. You can make a type of providential collapse for neoclassical theism. Fortunately, I can provide you guys some sort of an answer that I thought of today. But if we just go, I think I made a syllogism for it. It's a big syllogism though. So if God is different across possible worlds, there is either a determinate or indeterminate reason for this difference. So the way that a neoclassical theist might want to escape the modal collapse is by saying, well, maybe God is cross-world variant. So then premise 2, God is different across possible worlds. Conclusion, therefore there is either a determinate or indeterminate reason for this difference. Premise 3, if the difference is determined, God can't be different across possible worlds because then the way he intrinsically exists would be the only explanation of how he could intrinsically be. Basically, if differences in God were causally determined to be so, they couldn't be different because we just said they're determined. So definitionally, it's indeterminate, right? So conclusion 2, therefore differences in God are indeterminate. Premise 4, if an indeterminate difference in God contributes to his causality, then his causality is indeterminate. This is where I think it's a bit shaky on the argument here. I think the language is a bit loose on that premise 4. And here's what I mean. So where you put the causal indeterminacy in God could actually affect whether this argument is true or not, because we get to the conclusion, therefore God's will is not intentional. Now, what a neoclassical theist might say is, well, perhaps God's will is what's indeterminate, because then you would get probably the conclusion of that argument if you take a certain view of providence and intentionality, right? Um, then maybe you might just say maybe the causal indeterminacy is with regards to the motivational factors that God has, these motivational properties that contribute towards willing a certain X over a certain Y. Well, if that's the case, then the causal indeterminacy in the chain is maybe a few steps behind God's willing or something like that, right? Maybe you might want to say that, and that might be how you can escape this, because then you can say God's will is determinate, but just what motivates that willing is indeterminate. So it can be, it can will contingent things in some aspect. That's an interesting solution to it. There are other solutions that some people might try to go for. Some people might say weird stuff like God has brute facts in him or something strange, or they might try and put the causal indeterminacy somewhere else. Or they might just embrace necessitarianism. But that's an interesting way of throwing a jab back at maybe a neoclassical theist that might be trying to use that providential collapse to beat you up. You might say, well, you guys are like kind of have the same problem. You also have to say there's indeterminacy somewhere. So where are you putting that at? But I think that there's a answer to that. I'll have to attend liturgy in 10 minutes. If this is going to end, God bless you. See you in the next live stream on Discord. Thank you, Lorenzo, for turning up. Thank you. Big support of the channel. React to it in the next live. You know what? I think I will. I think I will. I'll probably be ending the stream in a minute now then. Trent Horn and Redeemed Zuna are going to debate, by the way. That will be very interesting to watch. I've not seen how good Redeemed Zuma is. I haven't consumed a lot of his content, so maybe he's like really knowledgeable. I don't know. This Redeemed Zuma guy, should I listen to him as a Roman Catholic? Is he interesting? I don't know. Some other people in the comment section are gonna have to answer you there, because I haven't consumed too much of his content. I know he does like Minecraft Christianity on YouTube, and he's very popular. That's called the most I know, and I know he's trying to like do some like reconquista of Protestantism where he changes it back to conservative, which good on him, good on him. But unless there's anything else that anyone wants me to talk about, I think that's it. All right. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, please leave a like, subscribe, and even share this video. Maybe you have a friend that believes in divine simplicity that you want to share this to and be like, hey, do you have any good answers to what this guy is saying here? If you do, I am more than open to engaging with any sort of engagement to this argument that someone can provide. Okay? I'm more than open to that. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, God bless you all. Thank you for attending the stream. Thank you for showing your support. Please leave a like, share, and subscribe. God bless.